There is a chapter in the book of Isaiah that was read publicly in synagogues for centuries, and then it was removed. Not accidentally lost, not replaced with another passage deliberately excised from the lectionary cycle. The question nobody asks is what the readers heard before they stopped reading it. Because the decision to remove a text from public worship is not made lightly. It means that the text itself became dangerous. It means that hearing it aloud created a problem that could not be ignored. And if you look at the chapter that was removed, Isaiah 53, you will find that the problem is not hidden in a disputed translation or a difficult metaphor. It is sitting in the open, in a single Hebrew word that the rabbis understood perfectly well, and that most modern readers simply pass over. The Jewish lectionary cycle, as it developed in the first centuries of the Common Era, included readings from the prophets called the Haftarah. These readings were paired with the Torah portions, and they were carefully selected. The book of Isaiah was used extensively. But here is the detail that matters when the Haftarah cycle was fixed, possibly as early as the 2nd century. The passage that includes Isaiah 5213 through 5312 was skipped. The chapter immediately before it, Isaiah 52, was read. The chapter after it, Isaiah 54, was read. But the chapter itself, one Christians would later call the suffering servant passage, was gone, and no ancient source explains why. It is a silence that speaks. Scrolls did not simply lose a column. Readers did not forget a portion. The gap was intentional, and every copyist and every reader after that moment knew the space where the text should have been. The most plausible explanation is that the chapter was removed precisely because it was too useful to Christian apologists. The 2nd century was a time of intense Jewish-Christian debate. Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, written around 160 AD, shows a Jewish interlocutor being pressed on exactly this text. Trypho complains that Christians twist the scriptures to fit their own story, but the text itself had been read in synagogues before that. The trouble was not that Christians invented a reading of Isaiah 53. The trouble was that the reading already made sense in the original language. The Hebrew vocabulary of the chapter points to something that the rabbis could not accept and could not explain away. Consider the word that appears in verse 10. The Masoretic text reads, "If he makes his soul an asham." That word asham is a technical term from the sacrificial system. It appears over 40 times in Leviticus, always in the context of the guilt offering, a specific kind of sacrifice for specific kinds of sins. The guilt offering was not a general atonement. It was for sins that had been committed knowingly, sins that created a debt that had to be repaid. The animal was slaughtered, its blood was applied, and the debt was considered settled. Now in Isaiah 53, that word is applied to a person. The servant's soul is an asham. That is not a metaphor. It is a categorical statement. The servant does not merely suffer alongside the guilty. He is the sacrifice that settles the debt. And there is more. In Leviticus, the guilt offering had a unique requirement: the offender had to make restitution to the person wronged, plus add a fifth of the value before the sacrifice could be offered. The asham was not a standalone ritual. It was the culmination of a process of repair. When Isaiah calls the servant an asham, he is saying that the servant's death accomplishes what the sacrificial system could only picture: the full restoration of what was broken by sin. The debt is not just covered. It is paid back, canceled so completely that the creditor no longer holds the note. The one who makes his soul an asham does not merely absorb punishment. He restores the relationship that sin had destroyed, making it possible for the guilty to stand again in the presence of God without shame. You might think that such a word would be a translator's footnote, a curiosity for Hebrew scholars. But it does far more than decorate the point. It shifts the argument. The verse does not say that the servant is like a guilt offering, or that his suffering resembles one. It says that his very being, his soul, his nephesh, is placed in that category. In the entire Hebrew Bible, no other human being is ever called an asham. The word is reserved for animals and for one mysterious figure in this chapter. And the people who removed this text from the synagogue readings knew exactly what that meant. If the servant is an asham, then his death is not a tragedy. It is a transaction, and if the text is read aloud year after year, someone will eventually ask, who is this, and what did he actually accomplish? The cultural context of the removal is not a footnote about liturgical history. It is a physical reality. Imagine the synagogue in the late 1st century or early 2nd century. The Torah has been read. The reader steps forward, the scroll of Isaiah unrolled to the prescribed portion, his fingers tracing the columns as he finds his place. He begins at 5213, and the congregation hears, "Behold, my servant shall act wisely, he shall be high and lifted up, and shall be exalted." The words are majestic, but then they descend. By verse 3, the servant is despised and rejected. By verse 5, he is pierced for transgressions. By verse 10, his soul is in a sham. And there is no second reading, no explanation. The text sits in the air, and you can hear the silence after the last syllable. In the back of the room, there is a man who has heard the Christians argue that this text points to Jesus. Someone shifts in his seat. The rabbi knows that if this passage keeps being read, the question will keep coming. So it is removed. The silence is a decision. That is not merely a historical observation. It is a mirror for anyone who has ever found a passage of Scripture uncomfortable and chosen to skip it. The removal of Isaiah 53 from the synagogue lectionary is an ancient act of avoidance, and every reader of the Bible has done something similar. You have skipped the passage about the rich young ruler when you were calculating your budget. You have glossed over the Sermon on the Mount when you were nursing a grievance. You have told yourself it means something else when it clearly meant what it said. The rabbis who removed this chapter were not villains. They were protectors of a tradition that felt threatened. But the text itself does not cooperate with protection. It remains, waiting for someone to ask why. Now the question that has been hanging since the first paragraph: what exactly was in that chapter that made it unbearable? Not just the idea of a suffering servant, that was not new. Isaiah himself had suffered, and Jeremiah had been beaten. The unbearable thing was not the suffering. It was the asham. It was the claim that one person's soul could function as a guilt offering for many, that the debt of others could be transferred to a single innocent. That is a theological claim that cannot be smoothed out. It demands a decision, and the rabbis who removed the chapter made their decision. They decided that whatever this servant was, he was not the Messiah, and the text could not be read as if he were. But the removal of a text does not answer the question. It only postpones it. The scroll is rolled closed. The next week, a different portion is read. The congregation moves on, but the text itself does not disappear. It sits in the synagogue in the same scroll, a few columns away, and everyone who knows the lectionary knows that it was skipped. The chapter was removed not because it was unclear, but because it was too clear. And the one word that made it unbearable, the word asham. Guilt offeringis, the word that the present-day reader still struggles to understand today. It demands an answer that the synagogue could not give, and that many Christians have given too quickly, without ever stopping to ask what the word actually means in the mouth of the prophet. The chapter is waiting for that question to be asked again. So the question must be asked again, and this time with full attention to what the word actually demands. The asham is not a metaphor for suffering. It is a legal and sacrificial category that redefines the nature of the servant's work. The rabbis who removed the chapter understood this. What they could not accept was the conclusion that naturally follows if the servant is an asham. Then he is not merely a martyr who dies for a cause. He is a substitute whose death accomplishes what no animal sacrifice could ever accomplish: full and final settlement of a debt that the guilty could not pay themselves. That is not a poetic exaggeration. That is the plain force of the Hebrew text, sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone to stop avoiding it. But there is another word in this chapter that deepens the problem, and it appears in verse 4. The verse reads, "Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows." The word translated griefs is koli, which means sickness or disease, and the word for sorrows is makab, meaning pain or anguish. But the verb borne is nasa, and that same verb is used throughout the sacrificial system for the bearing of guilt. When the scapegoat is sent into the wilderness on the Day of Atonement, the high priest lays his hands on its head and confesses the sins of the people, and it carries nasa those sins away into the wilderness. The transfer is physical, tangible, irreversible. When the priest bears the iniquity of the congregation, the same verb appears. So the verse is not saying that the servant merely sympathizes with human suffering. It is saying that he takes upon himself the guilt that produces that suffering. The sickness and pain are not his own, they are transferred to him, and he carries them away. Now watch what happens when you put that together with the asham in verse 10. The servant does not just feel the weight of human sin. He functions as the mechanism by which that sin is removed. The language is precise, surgical, liturgical. It is not the language of inspiration or example. It is the language of sacrifice. And the people who removed this text from the synagogue knew that language intimately. They knew what it meant to slaughter a guilt offering knife. The blood, the fire, the smoke rising as the debt was settled. They knew that the animal was not a symbol, it was a transaction. So when they heard the prophet call a human being an asham, they understood that the text was claiming something about the servant that no other text in the Hebrew Bible claims about any other person, and they could not allow that claim to be read aloud. The historical context here is not merely academic. The synagogue in the 2nd century was a community under pressure. After the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the sacrificial system had ended. The guilt offering could no longer be offered. The altar lay in ruins, and the blood that once covered sin had ceased to flow. And then the Christians emerged, claiming that Jesus was the final sacrifice, the ultimate asham. They pointed to Isaiah 53 and said this is who he was, and this is what he did. The rabbis had to respond. They could not say the text was wrong, it was scripture, written by the prophet, given by God. So they did the only thing they could do. They stopped reading it. They removed it from the cycle. They made it disappear from the ears of the congregation. And they began developing alternative interpretations. The servant was Israel, or the servant was the righteous remnant, or the servant was Moses. But the plain reading of the text resisted all of those. The plain reading pointed to one person, one life, one death, one transaction. And that is where the present-day reader finds himself. The chapter has been removed from the synagogue lectionary for nearly 2,000 years. It is still not read in Jewish worship today, but it remains in the Bible, and it remains in the Christian lectionary. The question is not whether you have heard the chapter. The question is whether you have actually read it as the Hebrew prophets wrote it, without smoothing out the edges. Because the edges are what matter. The asham is an edge. The nasa is an edge. The claim that one person's soul can function as a guilt offering for many is an edge. And edges cut. Most Christians have read Isaiah 53 as a prediction of Jesus, and they are right to do so. But prediction is a thin category. The chapter does not merely foretell events. It interprets them. It provides the theological framework for understanding what the death of the servant actually accomplishes. And that framework is far more radical than most readers realize. The asham does not simply say that the servant suffers instead of the guilty. It says that the servant becomes the very means by which the guilt is removed. In the guilt offering ritual, the blood was applied to the horns of the altar, a physical act of atonement that restored the broken relationship. He is not a substitute who takes a punishment. He is a sacrifice that cancels a debt. The difference is significant. A substitute takes what you deserve, a sacrifice restores what you have broken. The asham does both. It satisfies the debt and it repairs the relationship. Now consider what that means for the person who has read this chapter and felt nothing. It is possible to read Isaiah 53 as a beautiful poem about suffering and never feel the weight of the word asham. It is possible to hear the phrase, "He was pierced for our transgressions," and imagine it as a metaphor, a kind of spiritual poetry that describes God's empathy. But the text does not give you that option. The language is concrete, sacrificial, transactional. It demands a decision. Either this servant is who he appears to be, or the text is the most misleading passage in Scripture. There is no middle ground. You cannot read it as a general statement about human suffering. You cannot read it as a description of the nation of Israel. You can only read it as a specific claim about a specific person whose soul was made a guilt offering. And if you read it that way, then the question becomes personal. The debt that the asham cancels is not a general debt. It is yours. The transgressions that pierced him are not abstract. They are the ones you have committed, the ones you have justified, the ones you have hidden. The chapter does not allow you to stand at a distance and admire the servant. It pulls you into the transaction. It says this was for you. This was because of you. And if you accept that, then you are no longer a spectator. You are the one whose debt was paid. That is why the chapter was removed. Not because it was unclear, but because it was too clear. It forced a choice. And the choice was unbearable for the synagogue, because accepting the Asham meant accepting the identity of the servant. And accepting the identity of the servant meant accepting that the servant was not Israel, not Moses, not a righteous teacher, but someone else, Somion, whose name the Christians already knew. The chapter is still waiting for that choice to be made. It is not a text that can be studied neutrally. It is a text that judges every reader who encounters it. Either the servant is the guilt offering for the sins of the world, or he is a deluded sufferer whose death was meaningless. There is no third option. The rabbis chose, the Christians chose, and now the present-day reader must choose. The text has not changed. The Asham has not lost its force. The silence of the synagogue has not silenced the chapter. It remains, and it remains for a reason. The one who makes his soul a guilt offering. That is the center of the chapter. That is the word that cannot be explained away. That is the word that demands either faith or refusal. And the refusal is just as active as the faith. It is the decision to stop reading, to skip the column, to close the scroll. But the text does not go away. It sits there, in the canon, in the lectionary, in the heart of the prophet's vision. And it waits, not for admiration, not for study, but for the one who will finally let the Asham do its work, the one who will stop avoiding and receive what was given.